Hi and welcome to this DVD, which is hopefully going to help improve your knowledge of figure sculpting and anatomy. To start off, let's take a look at the finished sculpt, which you'll see being constructed over the next few hours. As you can see, I've gone for something a little different than is usual for an anatomy tutorial, such as perhaps a generic symmetrical stance pose man. While that sort of figure can be a useful teaching aid, it's also rather boring and artistically flat, so I've decided to go with something rather more dynamic to show how anatomy knowledge is used to solve problems in the real world, rather than just depicting it in a cold technical example. I decided to do this sculpt in a somewhat classical stylization, which depicts more clearly the forms and masses that the body is built from. I'm using Mudbox as my main tool on this DVD, though it really doesn't matter which sculpting tool you use, whether it's the dedicated sculpting environments of Mudbox and ZBrush, or the built-in sculpting capability of apps like Modo, Blender or Silo. The techniques involved and the tools these apps have are all pretty much identical. I'm going to leave all the panels on the interface visible for the duration of this sculpting so you can see exactly which brushes I'm using at any time, and also the brush settings and fall-offs. That way I don't have to keep referring to what tool I'm using. This is not a technical tutorial about how to use Mudbox, since it's an extremely simple app and you don't need to know any advanced techniques or secret tips to produce a sculpt like this. I generally only use about 6 brushes anyway. Add, subtract, smooth, flatten, bulge and pinch. These are standard brushes which you'll find in any app that has even got basic sculpting capabilities. The base meshes I build in Lightwave, but again the specific app you use is irrelevant since you can do the same in any 3D app with even the most basic modeling capability. You can see how simple this mesh is. The only real rule to remember is to try and keep it as much as possible to nice clean even squares like this. This makes the sculpting go smoothly. Even squashing the quads into flat rectangles like this will cause ugly sculpting anomalies. I keep the face very simple as well. Some sculptors will model a lot more detail into the base mesh on the face, but as long as you keep nice even squares it doesn't really matter. I construct the mesh in a stance pose and then pose it by simply grabbing selections of polys or verts and rotating them into a pose. If you were building more of an all-purpose base mesh that you intended to use for many future sculpts, then it would be worthwhile skinning and rigging it so you could more easily pose it, but I built this mesh specifically for this and I won't be using it again, so quickly posing it like this is fine. I've already pre-sculpted this piece to work out exactly what I wanted to do with it. It's a reasonably complex piece and doing it on the fly while recording this would take too long, so I pre-sculpted it and I can now use the level 1 meshes to re-sculpt it for the DVD in a more reasonable amount of time. Clearly, even though this is still a low-res mesh, it does have a reasonable amount of structure to it left over from when I pre-sculpted the figures. This will help to speed things up, and I'll be providing these meshes so you can start from the same point. It might be usual at this point to start talking about standard proportions of the human body. You think of Da Vinci's famous drawing of how the human figure fits into a circle and square, though in reality he cheated to make that fit. I think it's misleading to distill organic structures down to geometric or mathematical proportions, or into systems of dividing the body into 10 or 12 equal sections, etc. You've all seen that sort of stuff in drawing books, I'm sure. The reality is that there's a massive variety of very different body shapes and proportions in the real world, and the best way to work out the proportions of the character you want to make is by finding some reference of a person that's closest to what you have in mind, and using that as your start point. So I recommend a site like 3D.sk, where they have all sorts of body types from dwarves to bodybuilders and from anorexics to obese people. Study these different body types, use them as reference, and never get into a mindset of trying to fit your model into some perfect average body type, because it just doesn't exist. The only time that's necessary is when making a tutorial like this one, where I obviously have to make a reasonably average generic model in order to illustrate certain things, and I can't give it too much individual character or odd proportions. But I doubt you'll ever have to make this sort of average model, because in the end it's the differences between people that are interesting, not the similarities. We're going to start off here with the front of the torso, which is probably the most familiar section of the human body, and everyone knows the pecs and six-pack and where they belong, but we'll start off with the underlying structure, which, as with most parts of the body, is determined by the skeleton. The hips delineate the bottom of the torso, and their presence is clearly marked in a lean individual like this. The sheets of muscle that make up the external oblique and the abdominal wall tuck in behind the rigid pelvis and bulge out over the edges. The hip is visible on the surface at the ridge of the iliac crest, and the navel is placed just above this point. Above the navel, the famous six-pack starts. This is most often depicted as a perfectly geometrically even set of six squares mirrored down the center. But in reality, there can be a huge difference between the size and shape of these muscle divisions, and they are rarely symmetrical. In fact, they can sometimes be totally offset from each other in a stepped pattern. The lower four divisions sit below the rib cage. And I say the lower four divisions because this is all one large sheet of muscle. The six-pack above the navel and the part below the navel is all one large muscle, but it's divided by a tendinous sheath. But the upper two divisions sit on the ribs and insert into the fifth and sixth ribs. Then the pectoral meets it at the fifth rib. Now I'm starting to work on the hardest part in this area of the torso to understand. The tangle of muscles and bones in the rib area under the pectorals. It's quite a confusing mess at first because there are a lot of long strips of muscle intersecting and overlying each other in the ribs. They all look very similar when hidden under a sheet of skin. There's three layers to consider here. You've got the ribs underneath, giving the overall volume and shape. The top part of the external oblique covering the ribs, and this splits up into fingers and connects to various ribs. And then the serratus anterior muscles, which originate from the inner part of the scapula and wrap around the ribs to intersect with the external oblique, like two sets of fingers interlocking. But you can only see the tips of these serratus muscles peeping out from under the mass of the latissimus dorsi muscle. It can be confusing at first because the two sets of muscle strips and the ribs are all running in slightly different directions. When looking at this area, it's not always easy to distinguish which is which. The best plan is to either choose to depict the fingers of the external oblique with the serratus, or depict the ribs with the serratus, and this is usually the case in reality anyway, depending on which pose the torso is in. Either the ribs will protrude or the muscles in this area will dominate. Generally, only people with very well developed muscles and virtually no fat under their skin have clearly visible and separated fingers in the external oblique, and only then in certain poses. In most people it remains a flat sheet of muscle, and the ribs are the dominant shape here. The serratus muscles are visible in a lot more people though. They're generally a lot fuller and easier to develop than the external oblique. So trying to show individual ribs, individual fingers of the external oblique, and individual serratus muscles all crisscrossing in this area is almost going to certainly look like a mess. So choose either the ribs or the external oblique, depending on the character. In this case, I'm going to show a well-developed external oblique interlocking with the serratus, and just relegate the rib cage to providing the underlying structure. You can see here how the external oblique, when it's well developed and flexed, blends into the tendinous sheath surrounding the abdominal muscles. I suppose I should say a little bit about the technicalities of digital sculpting, but I'm not going to keep referring to it because it's quite elementary and I'm using the same simple techniques and few brushes throughout this whole process. It's really just a matter of cutting in lines around the main areas of anatomy and then using add or bulge to bring out the masses between the lines, and then using pinch and flatten to shape the masses. I'll draw this out roughly at first and then smooth it all down, which evens out the topology while retaining the essence of the forms. And then I'll repeat that process several times, gradually being more detailed and careful. You can see here the little bulge or kink you get just below the navel, a little pouch of fat which tends to appear on any but the most extremely slim or ripped bodies, and it adds a nice little touch of character to this area in males or females. The pectoral can be thought of as two masses. The main one which attaches along the sternum and inserts into the humerus, and then a thinner part at the top which attaches to the clavicle and inserts in front of and a little lower down on the humerus. The main mass is thicker at the bottom and outer side and thins near the sternum, so that ribs can often be indicated here. Note the distinct hollow that is formed where the pec stops and the deltoid starts on the clavicle. Like I said, just using the flatten tool here, for example, to shape these areas. Just taking the big smooth tool now and smoothing everything back, because you can see I initially just rough things in with quite harsh lines, and then when you smooth everything back, the basic volumes and masses you've created are still there, and then you can reassess them, and you can start making them a little bit neater by cutting in and bulging again. Moving around to the other difficult area of the torso, which is the anatomy surrounding the scapula. There is a lot going on here. The scapula is a floating hub to which a lot of muscles attach and branch off in all directions. It swivels around the point where it meets the clavicle at the shoulder. The bone itself is hidden in a muscular character like this one. The points where the muscles attach become valleys surrounded by mounds of muscle, while in a slimmer character, or in most females, the vertical ridge of the scapula protrudes to varying degrees, and in extreme examples the whole bone and its distinctive triangular shape is clearly visible. It's basically a triangle with a mini clavicle attached to the top, and this mirrors the clavicle at the front, and both curve around to meet each other at the midpoint of the shoulder. The first thing you need to do is be aware of where the scapula actually is, since it changes position depending on where the arm is. Once you've placed the scapula, in this case it's rotated outward on the right side because the arm is raised, then you can start attaching the muscles to it. The two main muscles that cover the scapula itself are the infraspinatus and the teres major. The infraspinatus attaches along the vertical spine of the scapula and attaches up into the head of the humerus. The teres major attaches slightly lower on the scapula and wraps around the chest to attach further down the humerus. The main point to remember about these two muscles is that they are split by the head of the tricep, which intersects them as it comes up the arm to insert near the outer point of the scapular triangle. And also the teres major is clearly visible from the side in this pose, with the arm raised as it stretches out to follow the movement of the humerus. The large muscle at the side is the latissimus dorsi. This attaches along the spine and wraps right around the rib cage and converges into a tendon which attaches to the humerus near the insertion of the teres major. The cape-like lat clips the bottom of the scapula as it wraps around, and it can clearly be seen from the front, adding width to the chest. The posterior deltoid also attaches along the lower ridge of the horizontal spine of the scapula and sits on top of the other muscles. The scapula is also one anchor point for the trapezius muscle, which gives form to the inner and upper back. It's also anchored along the spine and to the base of the skull and sits on top of the other anatomy here. Even though it's one muscle, it does have two parts. The top mass, which inserts into the neck and is clearly visible from the front view. This attaches along the top ridge of the scapula and follows it right around until it meets the clavicle and attaches to a part of that also. And then a triangular section which attaches along the spine and the inner point of the scapula. The lower back is defined by the two thick columns of the sacrospinalis, which run up either side of the spine and create a distinct valley between them in this pose. They carry right on up the back, but they're only visible at the base of the spine. You can see an example here of why I'm not using symmetry on this model. The area around the scapula is different on the left and on the right. The teres major, for example, is not being stretched and is a lot smaller and fatter on the left side. And the scapula is in a different position as well, which means all the muscles are in different positions. Just defining the separation here between the upper part of the trapezius and the lower part, which we discussed earlier. There are two dimples in the lower back, caused by a gap between muscles in this region attaching to the pelvis. They're more apparent in women, but can also be seen to a lesser extent in men, if the lower back is arched and flexed, as it is here. Moving on to the arm now. Most of the mass of the upper arm consists of the tricep, which, as the name suggests, has three divisions, or heads, even though it's one muscle, and you should initially think of it as one large mass, attaching to the elbow and running right up the back of the arm and into the scapula. A large flat tendinous sheath joins the muscles to the elbow, and the muscles bulge out around this tendon. The largest of the muscle divisions is called the long head, and that's the one that runs up to the scapula. And as I mentioned earlier, it splits the infraspinatus and the teres major. The other two tricep divisions attach to the top of the humerus. The bicep consists of two heads, though the main body of the muscle appears as a single mass. The point where the two heads are notable is where it narrows into the tendons which attach it to the forearm, and here you can see a hint of separation. Another tendinous cord from the bicep runs around the forearm and pulls the muscle in, leaving a pronounced dip in this area, which you should look out for. Lying under the bicep, like a cushion, is the brachialis, and you can see the edges of it being squeezed out on either side of the bicep. And then the final upper arm muscle is the coracobrachialis, which is a cord-like muscle between the bicep and tricep on the inner side, and it attaches up into the scapula. Now I've been giving a lot of names of muscles here, and a lot of them are sort of long, fancy Latin names. And I suppose there's a debate about whether you should bother memorizing the names of all these muscles. Personally, I think you should memorize them. I think it's a useful learning aid because the chances are if you've memorized the name of a muscle, you've also memorized the muscle itself. And it's also useful when talking with other artists about anatomy. It's useful to be able to specifically name a muscle. Here you can see underneath the arm the clear division between the long head and the inner head of the tricep. The muscles that connect the upper arm to the forearm are the supinators, and these consist of the brachioradialis, which inserts under the tricep almost halfway up the humerus and runs the length of the forearm to insert near the thumb, and the extensor carpi radialis, which starts slightly lower on the forearm and extends right down to the first digit of the index finger. The forearm is made of a lot of stringy muscles and tendons which control the fingers, and it's better to treat most of these as masses rather than individual muscles. On the back side are the extensors. The two main masses to consider are this one, which we'll call the extensor digitum, and a thinner one which we'll call the extensor ulnaris. The smaller one is cut off by the anconus, which wraps around the ulna below the point of the elbow, and then wrapping around the tendons from the thumb are the pollicus, which wrap over the supinators and under the extensors. On the inner forearm there are three muscles, but they generally appear as one mass, though they do separate into visible tendons at the wrist. These are the flexor carpi radialis, the palmaris longus, and the flexor carpi ulnaris. The tendon of the carpi radialis is usually the most prominent at the wrist, but this changes as the hand flexes and adopts various poses. The deltoid is split into three main sections: front, side, and rear. The rear and middle fibers attach along the spine of the scapula, and the front fibers attach along the clavicle. They all converge about halfway down the humerus. The fibers in the deltoid are multipinnate, which means they grow out from their origin in a fan-like clump similar to feathers, so you can easily see striations within the mass, especially in the middle clump of fibers. I think it's best to deal with the hands mostly in terms of surface anatomy rather than underlying structure, because they're mostly made of bone and tendons, but what you see on the surface doesn't relate very much to what's underneath. On the back of the hand is a raised mound in the centre where the tendons run down from the fingers and into the arm. This steps down on either side to a lower shelf and a mass of the abductor muscle for the little finger. The ideal shape in the fingers when they're bent like this is a pronounced knuckle, which is attached to a tendon, and that thickens out as it reaches the second knuckle and becomes quite hard and angular. The overall shape of the fingers in cross section is quite square rather than round, and you need to balance this primary form with the secondary forms of the tendons and knuckles. Notice the sharp angular nature of the knuckles and also the flatness of the fingers. You can see how I'm constructing the fingernails here, simply by drawing in the shape of the nail and then raising a mound around the edge of that. The two important points to note are the curved shape when looking down the barrel of the finger, and also the curved profile when looking along the edge. Note how the fingers, when bent, all aim towards the central point in the palm. There's a notable mound here that transitions between the wrist and the hand. Here you can see the very pronounced tendons of the thumb in this pose, and a very noticeable divot they cause just above the wrist. You notice me just pausing here occasionally between sculpting. What I'm actually doing is just looking at my own hand to check it for reference. And of course that's the good thing about sculpting a hand. You have one right in front of you that you can see from any angle anytime you want, and you should use that. Now moving on to the legs. The legs are actually quite similar to the arms in construction, and a lot of the muscles and bones have close counterparts on the arm. The main point to note about the overall construction of the leg is how the lower part is slightly offset from the upper part, backwards in the side view and away from the body in the front view. The mass at the front of the thigh is a group of muscles collectively called the quadricep. Individually they are the vastus lateralis, the vastus medialis and the rectus femoris. This is bordered on the inner side by a long thin strap called the sartorius, which carries right on down to the bottom of the knee. You can see how the whole mass of the front thigh converges towards a single point on the iliac crest of the pelvis, where the upper layers attach to it. And another muscle on the outside, the tensor, also attaches to this point. On the back we have the bicep femoris and another group of muscles which appear as a single mass, the semitendinosus and the semimembranosus. The outside is marked by a large flat tendon, which is created by the convergence of the gluteus muscles and the tensor, and it flattens out the vastus lateralis at the side of the thigh and carries on down to become a thick tendon at the side of the knee, just in front of the tendon from the bicep femoris. You can see how the gluteus muscles attach along the ridge of the pelvis and all aim in towards the trochanter, which is a bulge at the head of the femur. The two large calf muscles are called the gastrocnemius and converge into what is probably the only tendon on the body that most people can name, the Achilles. You'll notice as I construct the calves how flat and angular they are, especially in this pose where they are being contracted as the heel is raised. One interesting point about the construction of the leg is how it slants horizontally in alternating angles from top to bottom. The best way to remember this structure is by drawing a zigzag line that starts at the hip and goes across the buttock, comes back across the knee, comes back across the bottom of the calves, and finally back again across the ankles. The knee is another tricky area to understand. The top bulge is the vastus medialis, and a band of tendon runs across this, pulling it in a little. The next section is the kneecap itself, and when the leg is fully extended, the skin is generally loose here and wrinkles across it, and the lowest part is the top of the tibia, which curves right down and forms the inner ankle. The tibialis anterior fits snugly against the tibia and bulges out further and a little across it, ending in a pronounced tendon which inserts into the first metatarsal. The outer lower leg, like the forearm, has a lot of short stringy muscles and tendons, which it's easier to break down into masses. By far the most visible mass is the long peroneus, which starts where the bicep femoris tendon stops and runs right down to a tendon that wraps around behind the ankle and inserts under the foot. The soleus is wedged between the calf and tibia and is slightly visible on both sides. Here you can see the curve of the lower leg and how it's offset a little from the upper leg. Here we see the thick tendon from the peroneus coming down and wrapping around the side of the foot, and then the tendon from the big toe which runs up on the inside of it, and then the other tendon which splits off into the tendon for the rest of the toes, and in between it and the peroneus you can see the inverted V-shaped hollow that is formed. The basic structure on top of the foot is this raised mound surrounded by a flat shelf. The toes are very similar in their construction to the fingers. In fact, you can really just think of them as fingers that have been contracted down to a shorter length. But the guidelines regarding the nails and the overall topology is very similar. You can see I'm constructing the nails in exactly the same way as the fingernails, drawing in the shape of the nail, raising a mound around the edge, and then getting the same curved shape from the front and side. One thing you do want to consider for the toes is giving them some character, which means just slightly altering their angle and direction and length to give them some individuality, rather than having them coming straight out from the foot. To look at basic proportions of the average head, I'm going to use a different head model because the heads on these two models are in quite awkward poses and they both have quite strong expressions on their faces, so they're not so useful for looking at average facial anatomy. First of all, we're just going to look at the proportions of the average head. The eyes are generally placed halfway down the head, and in an adult male it's quite common for the eyes to be a lot higher. A larger proportion of the head being the facial mass. If we draw a line along the top of the brow ridge and one along the bottom of the chin, the bottom of the nose is generally placed halfway along this line, and the mouth is 1/3 of the way from the nose to the chin. And the corners of the mouth generally line up with the center of the eyes. One more point to note is that the width of the nose at its widest point is generally the same as the width of an eye. Looking at the side view, the main point to be aware of here is giving the skull its full mass. A mistake people generally make is the skull mass being too small for the face. The distance from the chin to the top of the skull should be about the same as the distance from the brow ridge to the back of the skull. If you imagine two egg shapes, one for the face and one for the cranial mass, these should be about equal in area. To place the ears, we can draw a line from the brow to the back of the skull. Halfway across this line is the ear, slanting back at an angle. The height of the ear is about the same from the brow ridge to the bottom of the nose. One extra proportional guide I find very useful is this X drawn on the side of the face. This first line is basically following the contour of the eye socket, coming down under the cheekbone and then travelling on down around the masseter muscle at the corner of the jaw. This second line is more of a virtual marker. It's basically delineating the frontal plane of the face. And the side plane of the face. This line doesn't really exist, of course. You can see it's being intersected by other planes and masses in the face, but it's something that you want to be aware of. It's quite important when it comes to lighting the head that you have a strong frontal plane and a strong side plane. Now we'll get into the actual details of the facial features. This is really about learning the topology, the planes and masses of a standard head. And the better you learn that, the more quickly you'll be able to apply that to any non-standard head that you see in the real world. As with the rest of the body, I would normally sort of sculpt the whole head at once, but for this tutorial I'm going to concentrate on one feature at a time and finish that off. Starting off with the nose. The nose, like most facial features, can be broken down into several distinct sections. The upper part is bone, and where the bone ends you get a ridge, and this is usually the widest part of the nose from the front view. The bone then gives way to the lateral cartilages, which is actually two mirrored pieces of cartilage, and where they meet in the middle you can often see a very definite groove. The wings of the nose are not made of cartilage, they're actually just a sort of dense fibrous tissue. which is why this part of the nose is so flexible. The septal cartilage, which links the two nostrils together, usually favors either one side or the other, which is why if you look at your nose or anyone else's nose, it's not symmetrical. One of the important features of the mouth is the medialis, which is the little mound here at the corners of the mouth. It basically acts as a hub, rather in the same way as the scapula acts as a hub on the back, where there's a kind of a floating area with a lot of muscles coming in from all directions and connecting to it. The upper lip normally protrudes further than the lower lip, though in certain cases, for example, people who have overbites, the lower lip juts out further. You can see the medialis is quite visible from the 3/4 view. And you can see that the fatty mass of the infraorbital triangle, which comes down off the nose, wraps around the outside of the medialis. Just on the inside of the medialis, you can see a very definite dimple on the inner corner of the mouth. These two forms the infraorbital triangle, and the medialis define a very definite crease coming down from the nose. Another important feature below the lips are these mounds, which are sometimes called the pillars. You can see they're like little bags beneath the lower lip, and they wrap around towards the medialis. Moving on to the eyes, I normally draw in the underlying bony socket of the eye before drawing in any detail, because it's the bone structure of the face that's the most important thing. That helps you recognize individuals. Once you're happy with the placement of the socket itself and the size of the eyes, you can proceed to draw in the details of the eyelids and the eyeball. As with the mouth, it's important to remember the eyelids have a very curved shape, since they are obviously wrapping around a sphere. And like the lips, the upper lid juts out further than the lower lid. Now, one important point to remember about the eyelids is that they are actually quite thick, a lot thicker than you think they are. And it's usually okay to exaggerate the thickness a little bit while sculpting. The ear is a shell-shaped structure, and when constructing the ear, I normally just hollow out that shell first before adding in the details. The most important sections of the ear are the helix, the antihelix, the tragus, the antitragus, the lobe, and the fossa triangularis. And one interesting point about the earlobe is that genetically some people have free hanging dangling lobes, and some people have very small lobes which just attach directly to the side of the face. And note that the antihelix from the front view often juts out further than the helix behind it. The most important feature of the neck are the sternomastoid muscles, which attach to the skull just behind the ears and wrap around the neck and attach into the top of the sternum between the two clavicles. The other feature being the Adam's apple, which is obviously a lot more prominent in men than in women. Though, as I've been trying to make clear throughout this tutorial, none of these rules are actually rules, they're just guidelines, and when you look at heads in the real world, they differ. They differ in proportions and the size and shape of the individual features. For example, if you look at the eyes, there are two distinct types of eyes. The first one, where you have really sunken eye sockets, and you can really see the upper and lower lid really wrapping around the sphere of the eye, in this face, for example. And then there's another example where you can't see the upper lid at all, because the sort of bag of skin hanging off the inside of the eyebrow, which covers the top of the eyelid. So, just look out for these differences in different faces that you see. And again, try not to make your heads too generic. Moving back to the head from the main tutorial model, I guess the somewhat unusual point with this head is that, as with the rest of the figure, I'm sculpting it without symmetry. This is something I recommend you try, since it does offer additional challenges to the usual digital method of sculpting everything with auto magic symmetry turned on. Manually balancing two sides of a face while sculpting will enhance your knowledge of facial anatomy, and if you're still in the learning stages as an artist, you really shouldn't be taking shortcuts. Since we've already gone through the main points of facial anatomy, I'm not going to be covering that again. So I'm just going to give an overview of the ideas behind this particular head and its pose and expression. The head construction itself is meant to depict a hero character, so it's thick-jawed and has strong features. The pose of the head indicates empathy and concern for the other character, in the way it's bent round and slightly cocked to look directly into her eyes. Notice that it's been tilted in all three planes, and even a subtle rotation of the head in X, Y or Z can convey a different emotion or intention. The facial expression is designed to convey a mix of determination and anger, with the lips pressed tightly together and the brows drawn down. I'll be explaining the concept behind these characters later when I appraise them as an overall sculpt. You can see I'm approaching the sculpting of the face in exactly the same way as in the default head shown earlier. And here it's the hair that will require the most time and design effort. The exact design of the hair is something I just invent on the fly, since it would be too much effort to copy the exact curls from when I pre-sculpted this guy earlier. Doing this sort of heavily sculpted hair that you see on classical marble sculptures does require quite a bit of time and effort, and this took about 90 minutes to 2 hours for all the detailing. So obviously I won't be showing every curl being modelled, but just an overview of the process. Just switching up to the highest level of resolution now, so I can really start pinning down the details. The process of sculpting the hair is really just exactly the same as the process of sculpting everything else. Cutting in lines, using the add tool to add volume between those lines, and then using the pinch and flatten tools to shape the volumes. The most difficult thing here is deciding exactly what you're going to sculpt, what exact pattern of curls and overall design you're going to give the hair. And as with most artistic decisions, this depends on your experience, so you can get a lot of good ideas from looking at classical sculptures. But as I said, this process is going to take quite a bit of time. It's quite a sort of a painstaking, detailed sort of process, so I'm not going to show all of it. But I think you get the idea, and I want to move on to the final detailing of this sculpt. Obviously, people don't all have identical vein patterns, so there is no absolute right or wrong here, but there is still a general pattern that they follow, since we all have the same veins, even if they take slightly different paths. Veins follow a pattern like a river network in reverse, with big canals gradually branching off into smaller and smaller ones. The main visible network is the forearm and hand, and the veins here all branch off from two large ones that run down either side of the bicep. Only the one on the outer side is generally visible, and it carries right on down the back of the forearm, and is still visible as veins that split at either side of the ring finger. The trick with drawing veins is to remember they are not just surface features, they are under the skin, so it's not enough to just draw a line and then smooth it a little. You have to depict how the skin is affected and stretched between large veins. You end up with hollows and flattened angular areas on an otherwise smooth topology. You can see on the back of the hand I'm indicating hollow areas, raised areas and flat areas which relate to the various veins and tendons here. Moving on now to the other figure in this sculpt, which I'm not going to dwell on very much, since obviously the anatomy of a female is virtually identical to a male, apart from some differences which we'll discuss later. And I also want to talk about some general principles and the aesthetics of figure sculpting. There are three main component parts to successful sculpting technique, and they are volume, contour, and anatomy. Volume is concerned with the masses of muscles and sections of the body and how they fit together. One common problem I see in new sculptors when they post work in forums is the lack of volume, where it appears as though the sculptor has taken a blank base mesh, divided it up to several million polygons, and then proceeded to start drawing the muscles on the surface of the mesh. Even if they were to draw technically accurate anatomy, it still wouldn't work. Muscles are obviously not surface features, but rather like icebergs, where most of their mass is hidden onto the surface and you only see the top part. The best way to see how the volumes in your mesh are working together is to look at it from very foreshortened angles, looking down the barrel, so to speak, at low resolution, so you can see their curvature and how they transition from one to the next, and any deviation or bad form will show itself. Contour is the outline or silhouette of your model, and can also be called a rhythm. And it's extremely important that you're aware of what the silhouette of every part of the body should look like, and from any angle. That's not an easy task, of course, and it only comes after long experience of studying reference and doing drawings, because a pencil drawing of a 3D volume is essentially just drawing the silhouette. This is why I sculpt with a black background, so the silhouette is always very visible. While it is possible to make small tweaks by pushing and pulling the edges, you need to make any real changes by adjusting the volumes, of course. The third part is the accuracy of the anatomy. And you might think if you do technically accurate anatomy, then it's automatically going to look right. But that's not really the case. The whole art behind sculpting is not knowing the placement of the muscles, but on the exact and unique way you choose to sculpt them. There are endless different ways of sculpting anatomy. You only have to look at all the sculptures in the world. They're all sculpting the same thing, the same set of bones and muscles, and yet they all look different. Of course, I can't tell you how to sculpt on an artistic level. You have to make that artistic decision yourself, based on what you personally think looks aesthetically pleasing, and that's different for all of us. There is no right or wrong, but let's be clear that learning anatomy is just the starting point and the easiest part of the journey. As I said, though, female anatomy is essentially identical to male anatomy, apart from a few areas such as the larger hips and small shoulders. But one of the problems is that everything I'm saying is a generalization. There are women with hips as slim as any man, there are tall women with broad shoulders, and there are slim guys with wide hips. This all harks back to what I was saying at the start of the DVD. You must use people in the real world as reference for your characters, not some average proportions, because average proportions by definition are very boring. Even though women have the same anatomy, they are generally not as muscular, and therefore you have to exercise your knowledge of anatomy by reducing the muscle groups you know are there to larger forms and masses in order to soften them out. Classical sculptors would often take this to an extreme and model women with a soft and chubby anatomy of babies, to an extent where they have no visible anatomy at all, but just smooth round limbs and dainty little chubby fingers. Personally, I don't like this look very much. I prefer to give my female models some anatomy and a hint of underlying muscle tone. One very obvious point of difference for females are the breasts. However, the anatomy underneath is exactly the same, so just think of it as a man's chest with the addition of a tear-shaped appendage hanging from the bottom of the pectoral. And notice that they are at an angle at the side of the chest rather than pointing forward. One of the most common problems you will see in CG female characters are perfectly spherical breasts that look like balloons stuck onto the front of the chest. Unless you're very specifically trying to model a woman who has a very low quality artificial breast implants, then this is way off the mark. Real breasts don't defy gravity in this way, and they drop and become rounder at the bottom and outside and flatter at the top and the inside. Again, this is a generalization, of course. There are also a huge variety of different shapes and sizes of breasts, from completely flat chested to huge ones to ones that sag. But obviously I have to choose one basic common type for this model. Just a reminder about these sternomastoid muscles here and their tendons, because it is a very common problem I see in models. People think that these tendons connect to the top of the clavicles, but they don't. They run inside the clavicles and connect to the top of the sternum. As mentioned earlier, the scapula in the female is a lot more visible because of the lack of muscle definition bulging outside it. The ridges of the scapula become the highest point, so there's quite a visible shelf along the top, and also the vertical ridge is quite visible. As you can see in the female, there's no hint of serratus muscles or interweaving with the external oblique. I'm just indicating the ribs here. Women's faces don't differ a whole lot from men's faces. The differences can be remarkably subtle, yet we all instantly recognize men and women, even when they're in the far distance. This is mainly due to two things: the bone structure and hair. There are virtually no hairstyles that are shared by both sexes, and we learn to associate hairstyles with men or women. Bone structure is the most important feature of a face for both recognition of individuals and telling feminine from masculine. Again, there are no unbreakable rules here, but women's faces tend to be softer and rounder in general, with less pronounced brow ridges, softer lips and chin, a more delicate nose, and an overall less visible bone and muscle structure. The eyebrows are usually higher above the eyes than in men as well. The technique when sculpting hair like this is to deal with it in the same way as the rest of the body, which is to be more concerned with overall form and mass rather than details. So rather than trying to sculpt individual hairs with a rake brush, build it up using larger clumps of hair. In long hair like this, it's important to get a smooth, even, wavy flow. Again, I'm just inventing the exact curls and hair clumps on the fly. There's no exact plan here. Hair tends to be naturally unpredictable and random when it flows like this anyway. Moving on to the details of her fishy parts. It's actually very simple to lay in a lot of detail quickly using stamps. I created a stamp of fish scales from a photo of a fish I grabbed off the internet and can now draw the scales in a matter of seconds. The trick with using stamps is to remember that they're only a starting point, and you then need to follow that up with some manual details and emphasis. In this case, I'm going to pull the scales out a little more and use the flatten tool to shape them a bit. But it's not necessary to do every single one, just hint at it here and there. There's a nice tool in Mudbox called the contrast brush, which just pulls up the high parts and pushes in the low parts. And it's pretty useful for a thing like this where you want to just emphasize some of the scales here and there. And as for the tail, again, nothing fancy here, just drawing in some fins, and then I'm going to use one of the default stamps in Mudbox, which is actually of roof tails, I think. But it works well for this to add some cross-hatching to these tail fins. Again, after stamping, go in manually and emphasize some of them to stop it looking too uniform and mechanical. To finish off the modelling here, I'm going to look at how the two characters are physically interacting. Flesh is pressing against flesh at many points, and of course this means that it's going to distort in these areas. But just to mention the artistic concept behind this piece, it's based on mythology, as are the majority of classical and neoclassical sculptures, whether it's Greek or Roman or biblical mythology. This isn't based on any actual myth, it's just one I invented based on characters from Greek mythology. The male character here is the hero Perseus and his lover Tethys. She has been attacked by Poseidon, the god of the sea, who likes to carry off maidens such as her. But she resisted, and in his wrath he turned her into a mermaid so no other man could have her. The scene here depicts the moment Perseus discovers her. So he's displaying concern, anguish, but there's also the determined desire for revenge in his expression and his posture. Where his hand is gripping her side, there's quite a bit of pressure being applied. And since there is a layer of fat under the skin here, it will distort and bulge as the pressure is applied. This is not so easy to do when you have two separate models like this. What happens is that they just intersect each other at these points, and it doesn't look quite right. One solution is to make these two characters a single mesh, but that requires quite a bit of work, since it would require remodeling the base meshes at the areas of contact to make it a seamless mesh, and then UV mapping it again in order to bake displacements. And then there will be cleaning up required in the displaced meshes. What you have to try to do with two separate meshes like this is to hide the seams or the parts where they intersect. And the bulge or inflate tools are the most useful here. If you're a ZBrush user, however, then you have access to a much more useful tool to achieve this effect. The clay tool in ZBrush makes it appear as though two separate meshes are blending together, even though they remain separate, and it's exactly what is needed to do this kind of work. It's not perfect though. It would be nice if there was a smooth function for the clay tool that didn't separate the meshes again. As it is, all you can really do is add or subtract. But it does produce a much better effect. It does almost look as though you have one whole mesh. Now I just want to finish off by setting up a quick render in Maya using the subsurface scattering shaders in Mental Ray. There's a pretty simple scene we're going to set up here, just to get a nice marble render of this classical statue. Just going to create a plane for the floor, duplicate that, and make it into a wall. And we're just going to be using a couple of area lights and final gather to illuminate this scene, because global illumination doesn't work very well with the subsurface scattering shaders in Mental Ray. You see, I've set the accuracy and the point density pretty low just to do a couple of test renders, and you can put these up higher for the final render. And also the quality, don't put that up any higher than 1 for test renders. And then create a couple of area lights, scale them up a bit. So we want them to act as large bounce lights, and we want them to reflect in the marble, so we're going to make them visible to the renderer. Going to give them a quadratic fall off, which is the most realistic. It behaves in the way real light does, but that means they have to set the intensity up quite high, so we'll start with about 2000 and then give them a very light blue color to simulate daylight coming in a window. Now the meshes, I used the polygon cruncher in ZBrush to crunch these meshes down rather than going through the whole tedious process of using displacement maps and normal maps and things. That's a real pain in the ass. So for these sorts of quick renders, it's a lot easier just to, if you have ZBrush, crunch the model down to a more reasonable size. I think these are around 500,000 polygons each. Create a little plinth for these to stand on. I've already set up the fast skin shader. The main point you need to remember is to go to the light map tab and turn on include indirect lighting, so that it will receive lighting from the final gather. As for the color, I've given it a very, very light cream color. Marble really doesn't have any color. It takes its color from the environment, the lighting. If you look at photographs of marble statues, you'll see that they have a wide variety of colors depending on the environment they're in. So, these colors, you can change these colors to whatever you like. Also, the numbers here will have to be changed depending on the scale of your model, the scale of the scene, the exact lighting in the scene, etc. I've often tried to set up a sort of default scene that I could just bring a model into and get a nice marble render automatically, but it doesn't seem to work. It seems every time I bring in a new model, I have to readjust the lighting, readjust these numbers and these colors, and readjust everything really. But I'll be including this scene on the DVD so you can take a look at these exact numbers and things. In the specularity tab, I've turned the specular highlighting down really low. I don't really want it. I have no secondary specular at all, some 0.1 primary specular, which is virtually none at all. I'm really depending on reflections here, which is why I turned the area lights on to be visible, so they'll be visible in the reflections. But again, obviously marble doesn't reflect that much, so I've set it to 0.2. In the shininess, which is the amount of reflection blur really, the lower you set this number, the more reflection blur there'll be. The wall is just a basic Lambert with a very light pastel blue color. I'm going to apply the same shader to the plinth. Floor again is a basic Lambert with just again a sort of neutral color applied to it. Going to assign the same marble shader to the plinth. And also what I'm going to do here is just duplicate this cube and set it up as a shadow casting object. Having other objects casting shadows into your render without actually being seen makes it look more like there are other objects in the room, and it isn't just a kind of empty universe with only the objects you see in the render. I'm giving it quite a bright color, so it will bleed colors onto the walls as well. Add one on the other side as well. And yeah, I noticed one thing I forgot to do. You should always remember when you import OBA files is to go to the render stats and make sure they're visible in reflections and refractions, because imported objects have that turned off by default. Let's just render that, see what it looks like so far. I think what I'm going to do is just do what they often do in museums like the Louvre, where they have daylight coming in from one side, and then on the other side they'll have a kind of orangey reddy light casting a different color onto the other side of the model, which kind of picks out details on it. So I'm just going to add another area light here. In fact, I'll just clone the existing one. Give that a sort of orangey color, and then turn it down a little bit, and give that another render. Yeah, I think that looks fine for a quick render. This is not meant to be a fancy final production piece. It's just a nice way of showing off the model. And just to finish it off, you can go back into the render panel and put the settings up as high as you like for the final render. Raising the anti-aliasing will reduce graining in the shadows. This might become a problem if you have a lot of blur on the reflections. You might need to set it up to 3 or 4, which is obviously going to slow down rendering. And in the final gather, you can up the point density and accuracy to get more accurate shadow casting. So that's about it for this tutorial. I hope you learned enough to make it worth watching. But of course, it's up to you to put in the years of hard work and study that it takes to really get to a high level in any discipline. But then anything worth doing is not easy. But I recommend you study the work of classical and neoclassical sculptors to learn the aesthetics of anatomy depiction, so you can then put your technical knowledge of it to good use. The goal is always to give it your own unique mix of realism and artistry. Even when depicting a photorealistic character from photo reference, you still have to make artistic decisions about how exactly you're going to depict it, rather than just slavishly copying what's there, because in that case you may as well just use a 3D scanner to create the model for you, as it will always be more accurate. But good artistic interpretation will always beat mechanical accuracy, which is why I don't envision computers and software taking over modelling jobs from humans in the near future.